welcome everybody to the philosophy stream again. This is the Awakening Philosophy podcast stream. We stream on Twitch and it gets recorded and posted to YouTube. Feel free to join us at Awakening Philosophy at twitch.tv or Awakening Philosophy at YouTube. Now let's recap on where we are so far. So far, we are going along in the Parmenides series, in which we read the Parmenides text as a way of highlighting what exactly philosophy is, how it functions, and why we should care, how it affects us. So let's reiterate those things. What philosophy is in itself. How does philosophy affect us? How then do we, having been affected by philosophy, relate to our world, relate to ourselves, relate to each other, relate to our goals, how we're benefited by that? And then finally, given how this philosophy affects us in our world, in our lives, what we should do, how we should think about philosophy itself. How then we should reflect on philosophy, how then we should read the texts, how we should talk about philosophy in our lives, with our friends, with others who are also into philosophy. These are the four things we're exploring in philosophy. What it is in itself, how it affects us, how we can benefit in our lives having been affected, and then what we should do with philosophy given that understanding. Should we care about philosophy? Should we give two hoots? Should we read philosophy? And it's that last section, us therefore seeing the benefit, or maybe understanding what potentially could be our benefit. This is this fourth thing, us relating back to philosophy, is why we are reading the Parmenides. By reading the Parmenides, we can understand the book, which is fantastic because it's an amazing book. It's often called the greatest book never read. It's a masterpiece. But also in reading the book, we can gain an understanding of what the Logos is and how we're using it, what we need to go through to unpack and understand this text. Awakens our mind to the Logos. What is the Logos? Well, we've talked about how the Logos is our path, it's our journey, it's Ariadne's cord. Some people might know of Ariadne's cord from the Minotaur myth. It's a myth of I think it's Theseus, who has to go into this giant maze underneath the castle and find this ancient beast that's half man, half bull. And he has to slay the Minotaur. But what happens is people get lost in this maze. It's called the labyrinth. They get lost in the labyrinth and they can't find their way out and they get trapped down there. And the Minotaur races in and gobbles them up. In the story of how the Minotaur is defeated, Theseus is given a golden cord, a golden thread from someone named Ariadne that he ties to the start, and he goes through the labyrinth and he can find his way out through following Ariadne's cord. He can find his way out of the confusion he's in, out of the maze he's in, to his success, to his goal, and to his victory. We are doing the same thing. We are following a golden thread that reaches out to us in every area of our life, but specifically, it's easier to see it in texts that are written about the Logos. That thread is the Logos. That's our thread. That's our golden cord that we can follow out of the puzzles of our life, out of the confusions and the difficulties and the problems of our life, out to the real world. In philosophy, we call the real world the world of being. But you could also say we can follow this golden thread out of our confusion, out of the maze, to our goals, to our success, to our happiness. That's why we do philosophy. And logos is that thread. So we're learning about the logos so that we can use it to escape the problems in our life and also find our highest success. Logos being the understandable, keyword understanding, knowable. There is something special about the logos that allows you to know it at a higher level. Providential, another keyword. What does that mean? It is something that extends a divine benefit to us. It can benefit us immediately in helping us understand the text that we're reading, understand our problems, but also benefits our soul. And a special kind of learning that we can take with us. Perhaps even a learning we can take with us in our soul, in our mind, in our seeing that will transcend even this incarnation we're currently in. Perhaps that's one of the questions in philosophy, right? I hope I'm not the first one to tell you about this, but you're going to die. Sorry to break the news so harshly. But so we have a question in philosophy, given that we're all going to die one day, what's the point of this incarnation? Why are we here? One of the philosophical answers to that question is, well, we can benefit from being here. If we couldn't benefit, then it was kind of a waste of time. What's the point? We face difficulties and pains and ignorance and suffering. Why? Well, if there is something we can benefit from having gone through this, something we can take with us, when we leave the physical incarnation, that would be an answer. That would add reason, add meaning, add justice to what we're experiencing. That kind of learning might be the logos. Why? Because the logos are principles that extend our immediate, extend beyond the human condition. Sure, it applies to the human condition. It applies to understanding human problems. It applies to understanding our goals. But these principles that we apply to our lives do not only apply to humans. Any being that has evolved to the stage where they have intellect, where they can reflect on their own selves, reflect on their own existence, and therefore give birth to these questions of meaning. Any species, no matter if it was in this planet, 1,000,000 years in the future, on a galaxy far away, any species that can awaken to the intellect, can awaken to the logos, can awaken to philosophy. So it's a universal kind of paradigm, understanding the logos. That's what we're after. And it takes some work, it takes being confused, it takes being puzzled. There are certain ways of following that path. Developing questions, looking for patterns, looking for key ideas, carrying those key ideas, jotting them down, or we use the analogy of the hero's journey. The hero that has a quest to go on in film and in TV follows a certain kind of pattern called the hero's journey. The real hero's journey is philosophy. So we can use that as a metaphor or an analogy to understand what we're here to do as humans on the quest to discover and know the logos. Another analogy we like to use is video games. Good video games follow a lot of the same processes, the same tropes, the same elements that apply to the development of a video game character apply to us. Right, that might make a lot of sense to you, given that a lot of people enjoy living the life that they have in a video game, in an MMO. more than their everyday life. There is something about a great MMO or a great video game that kind of appeals to our nature. It's like, this is what life should be. I should be able to level up. Hey, when I work as my video game character, I end up with something. I end up with a base or a house that I can build on, I can go back to. It's mine. For most people in our current society, under capitalism, we don't have that. We work all day to make someone else rich. Most of us will never, sadly, if the conditions don't change drastically, many of us will never have our own home. We'll always be renting. A lot of us are facing a housing crisis where even that is up in the air. So in video games, you can work and you can benefit. You can reap what you sow. And you can develop. Now that you've got a base, you can build your inventory. You can level up your character. There's something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which illustrates this really well. We have some basic human needs: shelter, survival, basic physical safety. And once those needs are met, we can then address the higher needs. The higher needs which culminate to spiritual fulfillment. When we don't have to worry about having a place to sleep, we don't have to worry about food or starving. When our community needs are met, then we can address the highest need: spiritual fulfillment. What is spiritual fulfillment? Philosophy. That's what we're doing here. Now, of course, we don't have to wait until all our needs are met, because that might not happen in our lifetime, given that the way that the world is moving at the moment. But what is interesting about philosophy, the path of the logos, the path of using the mind to know the mind, using the mind for spiritual fulfillment, to climb that ladder, is that understanding can be applied to helping you meet all the other needs too. So that's one of the issues some people have with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's not this and then that and then this and then that, like it's illustrated. It's all of it all at once. Meaning, while trying to meet your regular human needs, you can also be seeking your spiritual fulfillment needs. In fact, a lot of people would say, still do that the most. There have been philosophers who have, over the years, have said, hey, you know what? Even if it seems difficult, even if the world is pulling you to focus on practical matters, put that aside. You're not here for that. You can't take the practical with you. Focus on philosophy. Focus on using your mind to know the mind and the self, as well as its understandable nature, its logos nature. Discover the logos of mind, the logos of self, what we call the self logos. As it's the self logos, it's yours. Yeah, we're discovering it. We're awakening it in our memory, but it's yours. Why? Because you are the self. Self means you. What is the nature of the self is our puzzle. It's like the ultimate goal in the philosophical adventurer's game. Does your self have shape? Color? Is your self different from my self? Are there many selves, or is it really one self? Does it just have the appearance of many? The one-many problem. This one-many problem that we're applying to the self is one of the fundamental philosophical problems, one in many, and we've seen it come up a lot in our reading of Parmenides so far. In fact, the story of Parmenides, Socrates coming to meet Zeno and his teacher Parmenides, he starts with the one-many problem. Zeno, you've been writing about the one-many problem, and it sounds like you're presenting yourself to be saying something different than your teacher, but you're really saying the same thing. He is saying the self-logos is one. You're writing your essays to say it's not many, which is kind of saying the same thing. That's how the conversation started. So, this is what we've been talking about in understanding what philosophy is, how it pertains to the logos, Ariadne's chord, how it affects us, extending a kind of guidance and intelligence. In the text we've been reading, we've seen that Parmenides has pointed out, oh, by the way, if the logos and the ideas are understandable, are knowable, if you can think and intellect them, then they must have a nature that is intellectible, right? They must have intelligence at their nature. They must themselves be intelligent beings. So if the logos is the process through which the ideas themselves, our first category, right, the selves by themselves, if they can extend through the logos to us, Ariadne's chord, and they are in their nature intelligent, then they're extending a kind of intelligence to us. So we have a question about that. That affecting us, that's the second category. Remember, we've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. Actually, let's bring it up. These were our notes from last time. Actually, I can even make it a bit bigger, because why not? Ooh. There we go. Make me a little bit bigger over the side. Bit of editing on the fly. And we have our parchment in the corner. On the parchment is the text of Parmenides, which sits up here until we look at it. Okay. We have on our notes from last time these 4 categories. The beings existing themselves only. These are the 4 kinds of arguments that Parmenides led Socrates through last time. Socrates wants to know what the beings are. We want to know what the beings are. And so, why? Because it helps us to understand what philosophy is. Number 1. Actually, let me get my pen out. What philosophy is. How it affects to us. How we then relate to ourselves and our world. How do we benefit from these ideas, these beings? And then the 4th category here is Parmenides puts forward the idea that we're not relating to each other, but we can add something in. How do we then relate back to the original idea? Parmenides didn't add that to his last category, but we want to know how we want to relate back to philosophy, so we can add in an extra 4th one. Hidden 4th one here. So philosophy has some existing ideas that somehow relate to us. We're talking about how it's through the logos. That's why we're reading about the logos. That's why we want to understand the logos. Number 3, how do we live our lives better, having been affected? And finally, number 4, how therefore we should care about philosophy. What should we do in relation to not just our lives, but philosophy? Should we read philosophy? Should we talk about it? Should we use it? So that's what we've covered so far. I hope you're following along. If you have any questions, please jump in the chat and ask, or leave some comments below. If you have any suggestions or questions you want to... Oh, thank you for the follow. Hi. We are streaming this on Twitch, and... Oh, okay. We have a question about the Platonic solids. What a good question. Yeah, let's get into that. What do you think? I have heard of the Platonic solids. What have you discovered about them yourself? Ion Utama? Am I saying that right? Ion Utane? I'll say Ion. I haven't seen how... Oh, hi, Ion from Romania. Nice to have you here. We're a philosophy stream where we talk about philosophy and Plato. It sounds like I haven't seen Hellraiser, but it sounds like you've got a question about, or you've seen something about the Platonic solids. Would you like to share that? Oh, I'll have to check that out. It sounds like a scary movie. God was depicted as an octahedron in Hellraiser 2. Is that one of the Platonic solids? Ah, interesting. So, yeah, it's a horror movie. A philosophical horror movie, maybe. So, the Platonic solids are really interesting. What have you discovered about them so far? Do you think that ancient civilizations believed Earth was in the center of the universe? Oh, that is an interesting question. I think that some of them did. I think that it was important in early parts of our history to not point out that that isn't the case, because the church in the early days wanted to universe is in the center of the earth. That's an interesting idea. Where did you come across that? Famously, was it Galileo who presented the heliocentric idea of the solar system, that we go around the sun? But because the church wanted to think that the earth was the center, because of Copernicus, because of religious significance, he had to write a foreword at the start of his book saying, oh, this is just a mathematical exercise. Please, church, don't kill me for saying that the earth isn't the center. But in Plato, there's an interesting use of the idea of the sun. We talked about Plato's solids. So I'm transitioning across to ancient maps that had the curvature convex. Interesting. Well, Plato's view of the sun was special as well, because he pointed out that the sun and the principle of suns, all suns, in the planet, the octahedron is in the middle. Have you studied I'm interested in the Platonic solids. How can the Earth be in the middle? If that was where did you learn about the Platonic solids, and what do you think they are? So the principle of the sun in Plato is the principle of life in the physical world. I know very little, to be honest. I do know that the Platonic solids is something that you get to at the end of, right, in ancient civilizations, right, in geometry. Euclid geometry is very interesting, and it's Euclid's geometry is a completely self-contained, understandable structure. It has certain principles, certain math is the language of geometry, absolutely. And Euclid's geometry is a complete, self-contained system of understanding of two-dimensional geometry, and it finishes with giving you what you need to create the three-dimensional Platonic solids. Now, for philosophy, that's really interesting because we're interested in understanding. We want a complete, self-contained, full model of understanding of reality itself. And the closest thing we have, other than philosophy, is Euclid's geometry, where he says, hey, here are 5 things you can do. You can draw a straight line. You can make a curve around a point. I forget the other ones. And here are some 5 axioms that you must follow. Using these basic principles, self-evident principles, you can create a triangle, and then you can use that triangle to create another thing, and you can unpack the whole two-dimensional system of geometry. Euclidean versus hyperbolic. But what's interesting about the Euclidean geometry is it's complete and self-contained, but there is one principle you have to bring in from an outside source. You have to make one 3-dimensional movement to make one kind of proof. Now, that's interesting to us as philosophers because we want to understand what understanding is. Specifically, there's a kind of understanding we do in philosophy called the logos. It's an understanding that can lead us up to our highest knowing. It can awaken parts of our consciousness. So you could say it's a spiritual exercise. It's a kind of really careful, really high-level understanding applied to ourselves, reality, the mind, ideas like beauty and justice. But what Euclid points to is, hey, any system of understanding can't be both complete and self-contained. In other words, they have to draw on something higher, a higher model. That's called the Penrose principle. Why do you think it will make a difference if our planet could sustain life? Why would life be more valuable? Oh, what is the value of life? Just because it is less, so less is more valuable? What do you mean by is less? Yeah, it's okay. Why would it make a difference if only our planet has life? Oh, I don't know. Why would it make a difference? I don't see it making a difference. Whether we are the only life in the galaxy, we can still awaken the logos. We can still awaken an understanding that can be applied to what is most meaningful, knowing ourselves. People say it will. I think it's likely that there is life in the galaxy. I think there are some people who have come across such life in other galaxies. But what's interesting is if you did come across intelligent life from another galaxy, what would you want to talk about? Pokemon? Can't talk about Pokemon. They don't know Pokemon. What else would you talk about? What would you want to talk about with intelligent life? The idea of the logos using Penrose principle is, if we have a system of understanding that requires something higher for its existence, that means that every system like Euclid or anything, music, if you want to understand music, we've been talking about astronomy. If you want to understand astronomy, in order to understand astronomy, there are certain principles that it uses that exist in a higher system. In philosophy, we call the higher system that are the principles that, for our physical world, we call that metaphysics, which means before physics. And what we see in Platonic philosophy is those principles, those ideas, have their own existence. They are beings. And as they're beings that have an intelligent kind of existence, we can know them. That's what makes philosophy spiritual. We can have a kind of spiritual experience of the metaphysical world, of these higher dimensions. And that's what we've been reading in Plato's Parmenides. Socrates wants to know about these ideas, these beings. Hey, these ideas of beauty and justice and likeness and sameness and motion and rest and one and many. We need them to have geometry. We need them to have things. We need them to have, archetypes. Right. And so we've been reading the Parmenides, which is young Socrates, an ancient Greek philosopher. I think he's 19, meeting his teacher Parmenides, and he wants to know about them. How can we know them? Are they just concepts? Are they just nothing more than thoughts? And we've been reading, and Parmenides has been pointing out, no, they can't just be concepts, because what are they concepts of? Are they of non-being or being? Now, in ancient Greek times, they had an awareness that these archetypes, these pure forms, these beings, were knowable. There's the word that means to know them, specifically nous. So when they talked about nous, it's a kind of knowledge that means to behold. In fact, the name for those archetypes comes from the word behold, because they're graspable. Have you ever seen the meme, "Don't take yourself too serious, you are here"? Shows a picture of the universe. What do you think of that meme? Doesn't mean don't take your ego or your fears and doubts too serious, because you're part of a higher, intelligent, life is meaningless. There we go. Yes. That's one of the ways of thinking about the world. In the Parmenides, we've identified that as a kind of hypothesis. If you think that there is no connection to these archetypes that are knowable, because the word idea, which is the Greek word for these archetypes, means to behold. If you can behold them, then they're knowable, which means there is a relationship. If they're intelligent and beautiful and good, because these are archetypes, then the way in which they can relate to us will have a good effect. Right? If you have a hot thing like fire, it makes other things hot. Something cold makes things cold. If it's good and intelligent and caring, then it has a good, intelligent effect. The way I see it is, if there is a God, he just created a lot of planets in the hope that some will have life. We are a lucky coincidence. Right. This is a different hypothesis, similar but different. In the first hypothesis, or way of thinking about yourself and reality, you said, oh no, there's no meaning. It's pointless. It's called nihilism. It's a similar way of thinking, well, there is a God. See, in nihilism, there's not even a God. It's just nothing. Right? But you can say a different hypothesis, well, okay, I do think there is such a thing as a creator God, but he doesn't care about us. He doesn't have an active influence in our lives. We're completely disconnected, so we're just a coincidence. Can you see the difference? There's nothing, there's not even God, and, well, there is a God, it just doesn't care about us. Two similar worldviews, yeah. Now, what we're doing in the Parmenides is meeting a young Socrates who thinks like this. He's like, I'm confused. I don't know if the archetypes are actually living, intelligent beings that actually exist eternally or immortally. I hear that they are because I'm ancient Greek. That's what we say the ideas are. But I don't know if that's real. I don't know if we can know them. Are these principles just concepts? Do they actually care about us? Is there a way for us to know them in enlightenment experiences or not? I'm completely confused, says young Socrates to his teacher. And his teacher is going to outline all the possible hypotheses you can have, all the possible worldviews. One of them you pointed out, nihilism. Nothing means anything. There's nothing of meaning. There's not even a God. That's one of them. Another one is, well, there is a God, but he just doesn't care about us. That's another one. There are 9 possible hypotheses that Parmenides outlines. 9 possible ways of thinking. The opposite is everything means something. Yes, that's another one. Very good. Yes, another hypothesis, which, yeah, right. And this is a good way of thinking about it. Take one way of thinking and say, what's its opposite? What would be the opposite way of thinking? One of the hypotheses is there is meaning in everything. Absolutely. So that's we've hit 3 of the 9 possible ways. And in philosophy, we can learn all of them. So whenever we're in a low one and we're sad or we're miserable and we think there's no meaning, we can I understand that. I know that way of thinking. I know its limits. I know the sort of things I can achieve. I know the sorts of things I can't achieve. But I also know where it falls down logically. How come it cannot be true? For instance, when you're talking to someone about nihilism, that there is no meaning, well, you can ask a question. Well, actually, are you conveying that idea to somebody else who can also understand nihilism? They would say, well, yeah, of course. We're talking about it, right? Oh, okay. So for me to be able to understand you through language, there's at least one thing that has meaning: language. Otherwise, how can we understand each other? So there's one kind of connection: communication. So nihilism falls down. So that person who might be depressed in nihilism, feelings are archetypal gods that we live through. Right. That's a very good point. In philosophy, Tower of Babel. In philosophy, we take the idea of feelings and we make it even more higher. We extend it. Not just feelings, but the states of mind we're in. Because there are certain states of mind that come with all of these ways of thinking. If you were a nihilist and you think nothing matters, you might be quite sad. You might be quite miserable. You might see the whole world in a miserable way. But if you have one of those higher understandings, the higher hypothesis, yeah, that's right. Nirvana, the state of mind or the feeling state, is one of those highest hypotheses. One of the top ones. And horror, yeah, you could say is right at the bottom. The horror of meaninglessness. Or to be able to see that everything has an intelligence, everything has a meaning. And to be able to experience it fully with your state of mind, a complete oneness, or for nirvana, a complete one, that would be one of the ultimate states of mind. So you can take all of the states of mind and put them in a ladder. Equally so, you can put all of the kinds of understanding that accompanies those states of mind, and you can link them up together. This is Parmenides. We're talking about Parmenides. That's the text we've been reading. The Parmenides outlines all 9 of them, from nirvana to horror. In fact, that could be the subtitle of the Parmenides. Why do we care? Well, every day we shift between different ones. The luckier ones among us might have nirvana experiences, but even then, sometimes it can be a one-off. Sometimes you can have a higher state of mind and you realize that there is some connection, there is some meaning. But then later on in the day, because we're humans, our mood will change. Our way of thinking will change. But if we develop an understanding of the logos, what's the logos? The logos is understanding all of those things, understanding they're a part of a hierarchy, understanding that they're in an ordered pattern, understanding that we are in a journey to rise to each higher one, that's the logos, then whenever we're in a negative one, we can reflect on it, understand it, and use our understanding to pull ourselves up. That's the Penrose principle we were talking about. Even geometry, even the geometry which ends with the Platonic solids, requires a principle from a higher system that's higher than two-dimensional geometry. It requires a three-dimensional. But then the three-dimensional requires a four-dimensional, and then a five and a six. These higher ascensions to different dimensions is the spiritual quest, but it's also more specifically the philosophical quest. Because we are doing that through understanding. No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. What does that mean? I mean, that's an interesting point, because we can ask, well, if there is such a thing as nirvana, if there is an intelligence and a structure governing everything, why do we have sad feelings? Why are there some people who are nihilistic, who don't think anything has meaning? We would never understand the comfort of warmth unless we were out in the cold, I suppose. Right, the discomfort of cold. Right, that is one of the philosophical questions. That's one of the things that we think about. Well, if there is knowingness, nirvana, yeah. In one way, it does seem to make sense, right? Sometimes you only know pleasure because of its contrast with pain. But then there are other times, like when you're eating a delicious spaghetti dinner. Is a spaghetti dinner made more delicious because you ate dog food yesterday? Do you have to eat dog food to truly enjoy spaghetti? Do you need the miserable to appreciate the good? If you want to be happy, really happy, you need to have a really bad experience in your life. Well, yeah, that's the thing. Well, if that's the case, then what we need to do, you and me need to go out with swords and chop off legs of people. Give them a really bad experience, because only then they'll come back and thank us. They'll say, hey, thank you, Ion Tuna. Is that what it is? How do you pronounce your name? I'm calling you Ion Tuna. But that's not how you pronounce it. These people will say, hey, thank you. Ionut means John. Oh, Ionut. They'll say, hey, thank you, Ionut, for chopping off my left leg. Because now that you've given me this really terrible experience, now I can genuinely enjoy the good experiences. If that principle is true. But something makes me think that they wouldn't be so happy. But that is one way of thinking. Relativism. It goes both ways. This is one hypothesis or one way of thinking that we can see in Parmenides. Like if a child is spoiled, right? If you have a spoiled child, if you want to ruin someone, spoil them. Well, I mean, you could make the other case that people who grow up in poverty have less opportunities, and there are some people who are spoiled, who grow up in a lot of wealth, who live a much happier life because they have support, they have the means to follow their dreams. Not all rich people turn out terrible. But this is... you don't believe any rich person is happy? Well, this is one way of thinking relativism. Happiness is only relative to its negative. That's one of the 9 hypotheses. And then another one is there a type of happiness that isn't relative? Doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. It has nothing to do with your physical situation. A higher pleasure. that you can't even compare pain to. It's in a different realm. But it's a question. If there is a kind of pleasure that doesn't require you to suffer, to really be in it, to be present in it, yeah, like thirst. Thirstier you are, maybe the more you enjoy the drink. But if there is a different kind of, like a nirvana, feeling the thirst is the objective pleasure. So you're a thirsty person. How do I pronounce your name again? Let me go on. Is it Ionut? Ionut? Ionut Tuna? John Tuna? I see the universe as small objects. One small object wants another object, so he gets it. And then that object is happy. Because of unity, because of connection, because of ownership, because of control. What part do you think makes it happy? Like a planet. Do you think the planets are trying to collect each other? Like Saturn wants Earth? But if they did run into each other, wouldn't they collide and they both be destroyed? Wouldn't that be less happy? God was the unity and life is the fractals. God is finite and the world is infinite. Okay, now we're really getting into it. So we've talked about having, God wants us all to get back to Him. Right, okay, now that's important. So we've talked about different ways of thinking about the world. We talked about nihilism. Everything is meaningless. We talked about strict dualism. There is a God, but it has nothing to do with us. We talked about this. God does have a connection to us. He wants us to get back to Him. Do you see how that way of thinking is different to the other one, which, we're just coincidences. There is a God, but He doesn't want anything. He doesn't even talk to us, doesn't care about us. We're just dust. This one is, well, there is a desire. There is a connection with the divine. He wants us to unite with Him. So you can put that in the list. We've got relativism. What's that? Everything is relative to its opposite. You can't have pleasure without pain. You can't have hot without cold. You can't have infinity without finiteness. So we've got another one. So we've got at least 4 different ways of viewing reality. And each of them has different possible goals. If you don't think that there is any connection between the divine and us, then there's no hope of getting that unity. If you perhaps learn something, or maybe have an experience, or you see the problems in your own way of thinking, you might be able to get out of that way of thinking and think, well, you know what? I do think there's a connection to the divine. I've seen sometimes in my life there are coincidences that help me when I'm on the right track. Or I had this certain experience of unity, or I read a book about this great man who talked about having this nirvana experience. That can elevate you to a different one of the 9 hypotheses, which has a potential for you to have that unity. If you don't think that unity is possible, how can you have it? Unity is boring. Well, that's another way of thinking about it, because some people talk about that unity experience as perfect beauty or the perfection of bliss. The highest possible words that we have at our language are to describe that experience. But there is also its opposite, in that we can have a counterattack. If we're taught that God is scary, or like you grew up in a religion where we're supposed to fear God, or there are evil entities, then you might be scared of having that unity experience. So not only in philosophy do we have to learn that pattern, learn that structure, learn all the different hypotheses, learn to understand them so we can climb them, we also have to apply that logos. Logos is the Greek word for that pattern. We have to apply it to our blocks. Because if you're on the cusp of a nirvana experience and all of a sudden you think it's going to be scary, you better find out the cause of that. Who taught you that? Because that might get in the way of your experience. Just like thinking there is no connection to the unity is going to get in the way of you experiencing it, so too can your fear get in the way. And this is actually the biggest problem. We've been reading the Parmenides, and last week Parmenides said to Socrates, Socrates, you are in a puzzle, but let me tell you the biggest puzzle of them all. If you come across someone who doesn't think that they can know these higher paradigms, these higher archetypes, the pure beings, the unity, if they don't think that they as a soul have access to this unity, this oneness of the divine, then the worst problem for humans doesn't matter if they come across a philosopher who has great skill and great experience and can lead them through fantastic arguments. And even if that person is open-minded to follow those arguments, if they fundamentally believe it's not knowable, they're stuck. There's no helping that person. That's in the text that we've been reading, the Parmenides, this one here. Actually, we can bring it up. Let's bring it up. Let's read it together. Because this is great, because, we are so lucky to have a text written by Plato, one of the greatest authors of mankind, about his teacher Socrates, someone who's called the father of Western thought. Everything since Socrates is a footnote to Socrates. That's how wise Socrates was. But he even had a wiser teacher. Or maybe at the time he was wiser. So when Socrates was only 19, he met Parmenides, who was about 60. And they had a conversation, the same sort of conversation we're having right now. Right. That's the issue. These texts have been buried to keep us from awakening philosophy. But we are going through a revival right now. We're at the part of history where we can rediscover these texts. And that's what we're doing now. That's why it's important to have these conversations. And we're scrolling up to Socrates' puzzle. Because they're talking, in the Greek they call them ideas, the beings that have an existence outside of time. So the word metaphysics means before the physical world, before time and space. So if they're outside of time and space, they're eternal and they're immortal. And Socrates wants to know about them because he's come across some writing by Zeno, Parmenides' student, that says all is one. And he doesn't see how that can make sense because one of the beings is likeness. Like in our physical world, we say this apple is like that apple. They have a likeness. Or you are like me, and that we're both curious about ourselves. But what is likeness itself? Not its example. Right, not the example, but the pure self, and the expression the Greeks used is self by self. What is the one self? What is the self of likeness that exists eternally? That some people say is knowable if we can awaken the sense in our mind that has the ability, ousia, to turn about and experience these things. Now, if there is such a being as likeness, then one of the other beings is unlikeness. How can they both be one if they're opposites? Socrates is like, explain that to me. Not in the physical world. Like, I get it. Like one and many, right? These are two ideas. The Greek idea, which means to behold, because they're knowable. They're the objects of knowledge. But he says in the physical world, somehow we participate of those ideas because I have manyness, because I have many parts. I've got my left hand and my right hand. So that's many, but I'm also one because I'm one and you're one person. So he says it's not wonderful, it's not interesting to say that we have one and many in that way. He talked about, here it is here. If someone was to demonstrate that I am both one and many, two of the ideas, what would be wondrous about this? And they would demonstrate this by saying that, on the one hand, when he wishes to bring to light that I'm many, that the parts on my right side are other from the parts on the left, and that the front parts are other from the back parts, and in like manner the upper from the lower. For I think that I partake in manyness, plurality. But on the other hand, when he brings to light that I am one, he should say that since there are 7 of us, I am one man and participate of the one. And so that in this way he would bring to light the truth of these assertions. Thus, if anyone should try to bring to light that stones and wood and any such particulars are both one, many and one, we would say that self exhibits to our view such things as are many in one, but that he does not show that the one is many, or the many one. He wouldn't speak of anything wonderful like that. But we would agree to all what he said about us. On the one hand, anyone would first, but this is what Socrates is asking Zeno and Parmenides to show him. He's just a kid. Like, how smart is this kid? But if anyone, on the one hand, would first separate the ideas, idea is the Greek word which means to behold, the pure archetypes that are knowable. If they were to separate those apart, the ones that we've been speaking about, selves according to selves, which is a Greek expression, which means just themselves, not how they function to other things, but just themselves on their own, selves according to selves. If they were to separate those ideas apart, such as likeness, the ones we've been talking about, likeness and unlikeness, many and one, rest and motion, and all such as these, and then be able to blend them together and separate them apart in themselves, then I would indeed be in wondrous admiration, O Zeno. He's laying out what he wants to hear. How can likeness and unlikeness be blended together if they're different? Not in the physical world, like in the ultimate world, in the world of being. Thus, on the one hand, I am led to think that we should strenuously labor in the investigation of these particulars. But yet, on the other hand, it would be deserving of much more admiration if anyone could solve the following puzzle. As I said about this ousia self that is woven into the ideal selves. Now, the Greek word is ousia. We don't have an English word for ousia. Ousia is the part of mind that we have that can turn about upon itself. Not see through the senses, like sight and hearing, but can turn around and experience itself. Mind can experience mind. It's a turning about. Right. Also, it's sometimes symbolized as a snake eating its own tail. But what's interesting about ousia is, we are participating in an ousia-like thing now because we're reflecting on ourselves. We're reflecting on what's most meaningful. We're reflecting on the logos, the intelligent pattern of this text, which is written by people from a high state of mind. So we're turning about, we're doing an ousia-like activity. But what's interesting is when we apply our mind to understand a text written by that high level of mind, our minds are being raised up. So it's a turning about, but also spiraling up sort of process. That's ousia. But what's interesting is the beings for the Greeks in the world of being, the nature of those paradigms, those archetypes, is ousia. They have pure mindedness. They're always eternally turning about on themselves. That's what gives it their intelligent existence. And Socrates, even at 19, knew about this. They knew about this. It was part of their culture that we are now rediscovering as humans alive now. He says, this ousia self that's woven together into the ideal selves in a manifold way, just as you demonstrated in detail about the objects we see of sight, if you could please in the same way demonstrate in detail about the ideas which we grasp by the activity of the logos. This is what makes philosophy the complete spiritual activity. He's saying that we understand that we can know these ousia selves, these pure being selves, we can grasp them through the activity of the logos. The logos, this kind of understanding, careful, reasoned, friendly, together, reasoned understanding on the ideas and the self, can awaken ousia that can allow us to grasp this realm of ideas. And you're right, this used to be in secret. This used to be an education that would be only shared with certain people. So even early in this text, Socrates, one of the first things Parmenides said to Socrates was a judgment. I think you're worthy to talk to. So it was kind of a secret teaching. Here it is. After he said this, like this is where we were a moment ago, Parmenides says, "O Socrates, how worthy of admiration is your impulse in the pursuit of the logos." The first things our, Parmenides, the hero of the text, or rather the Gandalf of the text, said. So you're right, this used to be a cult, this used to be a secret teaching. You have to show that you have a good impulse, you genuinely want to know about the logos. You genuinely want to understand what's the highest reach of your mind. What is the true nature of reality? What's the true nature of happiness? Or the galaxy, or beauty, or justice? You're not just trying to argue for argument's sake. Then you could go through a series of initiations. But the thing is, we don't have time for that anymore. It's no longer something that we should keep secret. We should share the logos. We should share these texts. We should share our insights and understanding. Because humanity might not have enough time for that anymore. So that's why we're talking about it. So yeah, ousia is the eye of the soul that we want to awaken, that can grasp these ideas, that gets awakened through the activity of the logos. Yeah. But fortunately, thankfully, 2,000 years later, this script has survived. The Library of Alexandria has been burned down 3 times, but we still have this one. Perhaps one of the greatest dialogues that's ever happened. So that's the Parmenides. We've been reading it. We're a little bit into it. I'm going to be posting, I think we've had 4 streams. I'm going to be posting them on YouTube. I think there's a link to my YouTube if you want to catch up on the old ones. I might edit them today, make them a bit shorter, and you can follow along. But this is the Parmenides text. Yeah, and if you have any questions, we're going to get back into reading in about 20 minutes, but You can keep chatting if you want to. No, it doesn't have. Dude, I literally just started streaming about a week ago. I have like 4 videos from Twitch, and today I'm going to post them onto YouTube. I just made the YouTube channel. Yeah, I've been studying philosophy for like 20 years, and normally I'm a musician. You see some guitars behind me. There's one here. I started streaming music on Twitch too. If you want to follow that, if you like rock music. But yeah, so I've decided I just wanted to ask you now, yeah. I've decided to because philosophy has changed my life. It's the greatest thing in my life. And I got really lucky. Well, actually, that's a funny thing. I was studying philosophy in college, but they had it all backwards. They're in the other tradition. See, this tradition of Homer, which is like, more than 4,000 years ago, that created this Greek or Hellenic culture that came through, I think the earliest philosophy we have written is like one little passage from someone named, actually, we'll write it out. We'll get to our book, our pad here. These are our notes from our last classes. We have the Hellenic culture. Hellenic culture. That has the works of Homer, who made the Iliad, his epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Sort of, kind of. It's more like true philosophy versus its distortion. In the logos, when we're learning, we want to see the positive and how everything has its shadow. It's distorted reflection. So for every high goal you reach spiritually, you'll find within yourself a counterattack. Your old ignorance holding on. It's like that, but through history. There was a lineage of what's called the perennial philosophy. Odyssey. That's what Homer wrote. So in the Homeric culture, there was Homer, and in that culture, there was the ancient Greeks, Xenophanes. We only have just a small passage left. Oh, my spelling is terrible. Small passage from him. But he was the teacher of Parmenides. And this is what we're reading now. We're reading a conversation he had. Parmenides. And then he was the teacher of Socrates. He didn't write anything down. Didn't write. Which was a tragedy. This is a problem. We wish he had. So we give a frowny face. And Socrates was the teacher of Plato. Thankfully, Plato wrote things down. That's what we're writing. So we have the Platonic text. Oops. Texts. But, see, Plato started the academy. So he also started the first universities in the West. Started the academy. Oops. Which is the name of the school in Athens. Academy. How do you spell academy? AC. How's your spelling? Oh, you don't even. Is English your first language? I shouldn't be asking you. ACADEM. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah. ACADEMY. Romanians. Thank you for helping me with my English. So, there in our culture, we have kind of a couple of names for this. We can call this Hellenic, based on Homer, but these guys were also of the same tradition. So you could call it ancient Greek philosophy. It's often called Platonic philosophy because this is the guy who wrote down the conversation that we're reading about that Parmenides had. We do have a poem from the Parmenides that has survived, but he also wrote a lot of texts about Socrates, so we know most of our philosophy from him, so it's called the Platonic philosophy. But what happened is, one of Plato's students was Aristotle. And this is where everything changed. Aristotle left the academy. See, up until Aristotle, they understood learning as a kind of remembering. We have the access of these ideas, these beings within us, or we have a pure knowledge within us already. We study the Logos, we have these conversations, we study these texts to awaken through the Logos exactly what we read here, right? Awaken through the Logos, the ousia. Socrates' question. Awaken the ousia through the activity of the Logos. So they understood education as a spiritual task. And your question about East and West is interesting because this was one word for this is the perennial philosophy, which means the parent philosophy. So let's write that down, perennial. So now when we go to college to study philosophy, they think philosophy is lots of different individual philosophies. It's a manyness. Perennial. So philosophy was perennial. Right, yes. Facebook is a fantastic way of understanding what we see it today, how we see it today. So perennial is one. So of course, if you understood that there is a reality and a truth and it's knowable and our task is to know it and awaken our mind to higher levels, then of course there's only one philosophy. Just like if you, I don't know, become a mechanic, right? There's only one way to fix the motor because the gas plug only goes into one spot. You can't just, right, it's a war between philosophies now. But if you understood that, of course, if there is a reality and it is knowable, then all we're trying to figure out is how to know it. So it would be the same philosophy. All we have to wonder is, as individual humans, how far did they get? How far up the ladder did Homer get? How far did Xenophanes get? How far did Parmenides get? Socrates was Plato's teacher, but he was murdered when Plato was in his 20s. So he might not have been able to teach Plato as much. So Plato might not have reached the hypothesis. We talked about the different hypotheses, which is the ladder of the Logos. So Plato might not have climbed up that far, up that ladder. So it's the same philosophy, it's just a matter of how far along they got. Now, with Aristotle, we had a change. He left the academy. But he started a tradition that has entered the world. He is the guy who's we don't follow perennial or Platonic philosophy. We follow Aristotle. What was he interested in? The physical senses. He lost the metaphysics. He lost the whole point of the whole thing. And so this has become Latin. The Latin culture. So it's a war between Greek and Latin. So we could say perennial philosophy, or we could say, Greek versus Latin. Another way of talking about this divide is Platonic. Of course, it's not Platonic philosophy because that implies it's one philosophy among many, but we'll use that word for now. Platonic versus Stoic. If you read Stoic, yeah, it tells you exactly. Yeah. Very good. Stoic philosophy is Platonic philosophy. If you read it, it has all the same key terms, key ideas, key virtues. It's just ripped of all of the metaphysics. So that's where we're at. Our current education. So when I went to college and studied Plato, they didn't teach it as a spiritual discipline. Even though it says explicitly in the text that this is to awaken ousia, to know the beings. And you only know the beings to climb that ladder of the logos to discover even the cause of the beings, the ultimate, the self. But here's the thing. Let's look at what we were reading here. Socrates' question to Parmenides is, look, of course you can talk about one and many, or likeness and unlikeness, being together and also different. Because if you were to bring to light that the parts on the right side of me are different than the parts on the left, so I partake in manyness, of course. And there are 7 of us, and I'm only one man, so I also participate in one. So of course I'm many in one. That makes sense. And if you talk about stones and wood, like Aristotle, who liked to look at physical things and categorize them, botany and chemistry, these are all physical distinctions. So if you talked about stones and wood as both many in one, of course, that's obvious. I don't want to know about that. But if you showed that the one or the many is also many or one, this word the does a lot of heavy lifting. Because what does the word the do? It takes an adjective or a descriptive, like I have many fingers, and it elevates it to the word is anagogic, which means elevating it to its highest. The word the takes the adjective and makes it a substantive, makes it a noun. We're not interested in a beautiful thing. We're interested in beauty itself. The beautiful. Or the one, or the many. This is the essence of his question. What's the thing? Now, why are we talking about that here? Well, let's give a different color. We've got Greek versus Latin, Platonic versus Stoic, or perennial versus many philosophies. Perennial philosophy versus many philosophies. Notice something interesting. One perennial philosophy versus the many philosophies. You go to university to do philosophy, what do they tell you? Oh, this is Kant's philosophy. This is Hegel's philosophy. These are all these other European philosophers in the Latin tradition. One, many problem. The very same problem 2,500 years ago the great Socrates was presenting to the great Parmenides is alive today in our culture, a one-many problem. Now, what's the difference? Plato said, I'm not interested in a particular, in a one or a many. I'm interested in the one. Yes, the truth, not a truth, not your opinion, right? How many people, when you hear the word philosophy, they say, well, to me, my philosophy is, or my truth is. Hang on, I don't care about your philosophy or your truth. I want the philosophy. I want to know the truth. I can't benefit with your dumb opinions. I mean, we wouldn't say dumb, that would be mean, but that's what we're thinking. Now, here's the thing. Why is this a problem? If the Western academic tradition, scholarship in the world today follows the Latin lineage, what happens if in Latin there is no word for the? Can they do philosophy if there's no word in their language for the? That's the issue. They can talk about A this or A that. So what's interesting about the logos, it's a pattern that extends to everything that follows an intelligent hierarchical order in the universe. So in music, the musical diatonic scale that we use follows the logos. We talked about the movement of the planets around the sun and the different galaxies. Their patterns can be seen in the logos too. So there's an idea called the music of the spheres. You can represent the same proportions of the planets moving around the sun as you can the parts of the diatonic musical scale. Oh, this is interesting. See, the Fibonacci sequence is the highest kind of pattern. In the logos, there are three other analogies or ratios that create the octave, the perfect fifth, and the perfect fourth. But the parent ratio, the higher one, the one that most closely mathematically resembles the logos, is the golden ratio or the Fibonacci sequence. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about chords and the Fibonacci sequence. I haven't got there yet. I know it's there, I just don't know anything about it yet. Thing is, when we strike any chord, the chord will naturally make all the patterns you said. Interesting. Right. Natural harmonics. Right. Right. Those natural harmonics are certain proportions or ratios. And if you put the ratio, if you complete it, you get a 3-term analogy. A is to B as B is to C. And the 3 kinds of primal mean analogies, the geometric, the arithmetic, and the harmonic, are represented in those harmonics. And that's where we build the diatonic scale from. But it also represents, is the patterns that the planets follow. So these 3 kinds of relationships are in everything on the physical, but also represent the logos itself, which applies also to the metaphysical. So that's the logos we're discovering. Right. Exactly. Yes, that's it. The flower of life. These geometric patterns represent, in spatially and through life, the logos. That's the logos we're looking for. That's the logos that Parmenides and Socrates are talking about here. But they're not just applying it to the physical, They want to know how it can be used for its highest goal. Specifically, how you can grasp the ousia selves of the pure ideas of the one and the many. So it's not just making beautiful music, it's not just understanding the patterns of the planets, which is interesting, don't get me wrong, but they want to take it to the highest level. They want to go anagogic. Let's write that word down. I'm going to share with you a key word. This word is awesome. I think actually, I think I pointed it out before, anagogic. Anagogic is a word that when you have an analogy, maybe I deleted it. Okay, let's write it out again. Anagogic. So we're seeing that there's a certain analogy or pattern that applies to the galaxies, to the scale, to the natural harmonics, to the flower of life, to cell division. But if you take that analogy, oh goodness, let's make it a bit bigger. Analogy or ratio analogy is A is to B. This is a three-term analogy or a mean analogy, as B is to C. So my guitar teacher is to me like I am to my guitar student. That's an analogy. But you can simplify that as a ratio in mathematics. So one of the mean analogies is 1 is to 2 as 2 is to 4. Doubling. So you can simplify that as a ratio. Some analogies you can say as a ratio. So that's just a ratio of 1 is to 2. So every point on the analogy, it's double. Now, we can apply that to planets. This happens to be the analogy that refers to the octave. Octave of the musical scale. A is 400 hertz. The next highest A is 800. The next highest A is 1600, and so on. But if you take that ratio and you elevate it to its highest, what's the highest expression of that ratio? Then you get something called anagogic. Anagogic. That means applying the analogy to the highest. That's what we do in philosophy all the time. So if we apply this from the octave to, let's say, the world of being, or the ideas, then we've seen what the patterns that we can see in our everyday world are being used as clues to find what is most significant. Ideas like the soul, or the mind, or the self. That's anagogic. It's a fun word, and we're talking about, as philosophers, we're like adventurers, like we're video game characters that are leveling up. One of the ways of leveling up through the quest of philosophy is key terms. This is like a weapon. Take anagogic, remember it, carry it with you, because we're going to use it a lot. So when we discover things about the physical world that seem to be universal patterns or principles, we can use that as a clue, if applied anagogically, to find the things we're after in philosophy. In philosophy, we want to know the. By the way, these are all thus. Where is it? The soul, the mind, the self. These are the treasures we're after in the quest of philosophy. So, these mean analogies that have their physical representation. This one in particular is called the geometric, which just means doubling. That's called the geometric mean analogy. Oh, goodness, my handwriting. Analogy. There are three, so there's one for the octave, there's one for the perfect fifth, and there's one for the perfect fourth. Their parent is the Fibonacci sequence, or the golden analogy. What's interesting about the golden analogy, so this comes from, or is the shadow or the hologram or the reflection of the, put it in gold, golden analogy. Now, the golden analogy is a two-term mean analogy. How can you be a two-term mean analogy? Interesting, says Trick. Because a mean analogy has three parts. A is to B as B is to A plus B. So still a three. So normally a mean analogy is like my guitar teacher is to me as a teacher, just as I am to my students. So the same relationship is at different terms. So analogy shows sameness and difference. Sameness and difference is another word for likeness. It's like something. There's something the same, but there's something different. And that's expressed in an analogy. And that's interesting to us because Socrates is talking about likeness. He's saying, Parmenides, likeness. That's a key idea in the universe, right? It's the principle of an analogy. An analogy is the principle of creation. It's the principle of patterns. A painting is like its model. The universe is like the model of the creator, likeness. So even God is using the principle of likeness. What is likeness? Is it the same as unlikeness? Because you're saying it's one. In some way, there's a way of seeing likeness and unlikeness as one. So you're saying, look, show how they're different. Explain what likeness is itself and unlikeness is itself. Show how you can separate them apart, but also bring them together. That's the quest. Oh, no, thumbs up, not thumbs down. There we go. So that's the question that, right, left and right. Yeah, show how, yeah, exactly. Up and down. Show how up and down is actually one. Because it's, how can you say that? It doesn't make sense. But at some level it does. Now, what does that word mean? Plurality. Plurality, is that what you mean? Duality? Oh, interesting. I don't know that word. Chiral. Oh, I think you mentioned it earlier. What does chirality mean? By the way, this golden analogy, that's the Fibonacci sequence, right? So if you have 1 is to 2 as 2 is to A plus B, what's A and B? 3. As to, what's these two? 4. What's these two? 5. What's these two? 7. And so on. That's the Fibonacci sequence. That's the physical expression of this. An object or system is chiral if it is distinguishable from its mirror image. Interesting. So if it is symmetrical, you'd say it's not chiral. So this golden analogy is also called phi. The ratio for this analogy, because we talked about how you can have a ratio. This analogy can be expressed as a ratio. So too, can this be expressed as the ratio phi, which I think is 1:1.618 or something like that. Oh, they're not chiral. Because they're symmetrical. That makes sense. This ratio here, this mathematical representation here, somehow represents the logos. So that fundamental pattern throughout all reality that has babies that create the three mean analogies. So its babies create 1:2, which is the geometric. 2:3, which is the arithmetic, which is just counting, and 3:4, which is the harmonic, which is a trickier one to understand, but it's basically the middle term. So it's 3:4 as 4:6. So this middle term is closer to the smaller one. There's only a gap of 1 here. And there's a gap of 2 here. So this middle term is closer to the smaller one in the same relationship as the two extremes are to each other. So 6 is twice as big as 3. So too, the gap here is twice as big. It's a little complicated to wrap your head around, but that's what the harmonic mean analogy is. What does that mean? Well, these are the patterns that the physical world is based on, but it has a parent in the golden ratio, which is the Fibonacci sequence as expressed in the physical, because phi is an irrational number. We'll never in our physical world have 1.618, so on and so on and so on. So its closest physical expression is the Fibonacci sequence, which is like a copy or a shadow of the golden ratio. But that represents the logos. Why do we care? Because according to Socrates, it is through the activity of the logos that we can grasp the ideas that we're after. Beauty, the beautiful, the one, the many, the likeness. And then of course there's a question, once we can grasp them, how can we use them to know the self? So this is the logos that we're after. Now, all of this isn't supposed to make sense. I'm kind of like cascading a waterfall of information over you. But take what you can that sticks out. I hope this helps your quest about the Platonic solids. I'm really curious. So if you discover more, please get back to me, because I need to get back into the Platonic solids myself. But it is significant. It's significant because it's a... Oh, thank you. Yeah. Well, these are mathematical representations. Oh, I appreciate your company, man. I don't know if you're a man. Mathematical representations of the principle called the logos, which is our ladder. So if we apply our understanding, how? Anagogically, we can use this, so apply it to the higher as our ladder. a ladder of the logos. But that's what we're seeing in this conversation with Socrates. He's saying, look, I'm not interested in how one and many play out in the physical. I want to see the ideas themselves, the ideas, which are not three-dimensional things. You can see how they play out three-dimensionally, like how we might make a three-dimensional moving cube to show the shadow of a four-dimensional tesseract. But likewise, we only use that as a vehicle to somehow jump to the direct experience of the four-dimensional cube. Now, we can't do that because there's no jumping into higher dimensions in geometry, because that's metaphysics. However, if we go back in time, before Aristotle, we can say, hang on a second, the whole point of education is to make that jump. The whole point of learning is to prepare the mind through the activity of the logos to make a jump to a higher dimension. That's this side. Whoa, that's a terrible circle. That's this side of the equation. So our use of the logos through studying this text, through this kind of reflection, is so that we can jump from a three-dimensional shadow representation of the logos, of the tesseract, to directly seeing the tesseract. But as you're pointing out, our two-dimensional senses can't see four-dimensional existence. Because it's a three-dimensional eye. It's the vehicle through which we see three dimensions. But the vehicle through which we can see four dimensions is ousia. That's what we're after. Can we use our understanding of the physical world, the shadows, like the moving three-dimensional cube, to awaken the part of our mind that can see the tesseract directly? That's ousia. Whoops. That's ousia. That's the sense. And that's the grasping of the activity of the logos. That's what makes philosophy interesting. That's why we should care about philosophy. But if you want to go from 1D to 2D to create things like this, you have to make a movement that is not within the bounds of the previous existence. So this can only go this way, but if you want to go, you have to go this way. Down is not part of 1D. So it's a movement not contained within the level you're on. This is the interesting thing about geometry. It shows you what we're after in philosophy. We talked about the patterns of music and geometry and the planets. Why? Well, we're illustrating the sorts of movement that can happen in one thing, so that if we recognize that there is a pattern between each of them, then that pattern, which applies to all of them, must have a higher existence. The principle has to exist somewhere else, not in its physical expression. Why do we care? Well, that means there's another dimension out there for us. So if there is such a dimension of those principles, which has a higher existence, a more encompassing existence, because it affects many things, then we can make a movement not contained within our physical senses. If this is a principle of our physical senses, we want to make a movement not contained within this. So within a three-dimensional, we want a cube. That's this. Which requires a movement not contained within. That's ousia. So if we see that there are certain patterns that exist in our world, and we can understand them, like the mean analogies, like the Fibonacci sequence from which they come, then we are going not from the objects that we see with the faculty of sight, we want to make another movement not contained within the third dimension, that's not a different direction. That direction is ousia. That's the way that we can grasp the ideas, and the way we awaken it is through the activity of the logos. That's why we should care about philosophy. It can move us from the third dimension to, you guessed it, the fourth dimension. That's also moving, because this is a shadow. So this is a two-dimensional depiction of a three-dimensional object moving through time, which is itself a shadow of a four-dimensional object that we can't see. So that's ousia. Ousia is the eye of the soul. So it has wings. Oh, that's not. How would you draw wings? You go like this. So it's like a bat. So that's the eye of the soul that has the ability to fly. That's ousia. This is just normal eyes. This might be some sort of worm that can only move, and this would be a single cell organism maybe that can only perceive. They can only perceive in 1D. Yeah. So that's a good introduction to philosophy and why we should care. We can infer by looking at the principles of the things that we're interested in, using our reason to the highest level, we can infer the existence of a higher dimension. In fact, that idea is the Penrose principle, that any system implies that there must be a higher system itself. No system is complete and self-contained. The closest is Euclid's geometry, which is fantastic, and if you've got the time, we should get into it and like really master it. It's a fantastic example of this. But so we can infer the existence of higher dimensions or hypotheses. We talked about that with the different worldviews, the perspectives. We talked about nihilism, nothing means anything. Relativism, pleasure and pain kind of need to exist together. We talked about strict dualism. There is a God, but doesn't connect with us. We're just coincidences, and God doesn't give a crap. Kashmir Sufism, which is the idea that God does care about us, is reaching out to us and offering us some sort of cord, Ariadne's cord or ladder, so we can unify with it. That's a different one. We talked about nirvana, a pure qualityless oneness, a oneness that's not even a oneness because it's beyond qualities. These are all different hypotheses, different dimensions that you can exist in, different ways of seeing. And the model of all of them is Parmenides. Parmenides outlines 9 of them. Socrates comes in with a question and says, look, I want to know the one and the many. Explain that to me. Parmenides responds, well, okay, there are 9 different ways of answering that question. Each has its own kind of validity based on what dimension you're on. To a one-dimensional creature, nihilism might make sense, but they're all part of a higher process. And if we understand them, if we apply our mind to understanding them, we can climb that ladder, bring ourselves out of the depression and the horror of nihilism. Do you have time to react to a 7-minute dialogue between an alien and a human from an end of a movie?
Relax. Where am I? What do you see?
Am I dead?
Not as you understand it. Do you fear death?
Can you hear it?
Do you fear living?
What are you?
Whoa.
nothing you can understand.
What the fuck do you want?
We are very curious about your kind and your experience of time.
That's all this has been.
It is a curiosity to us.
All this.
We would like to understand. Linear time seems so impractical a state of being. To learn is a tediously slow process, and with each generation it begins anew. A laborious cycle of empty promise. It banishes mankind to the torment of ignorance, forever a child in the dark. How curious that nature could punish a creature so malevolently. You are condemned to relearn pain for an eternity. How painful it must be to possess self-awareness and consciousness as you do, trapped in a lower dimension such as you are.
Jesus Christ. What the fuck do you want from me? Why did you choose me?
Choose?
Yeah.
Why did you choose to decrypt the message?
You asked me that before. You came to my house.
We do not understand decision. We exist in one single moment, one blink of instantaneity. We understand everything there is to be understood in our world. Therefore, causality, probability, and consequence are a mystery to us.
That's something that doesn't exist in your time.
If man's experience of time was like ours, would he remain? Would he remain? Would he remain? Would he remain?
Oh, fuck.
Relax. Relax.
Fuck. Oh, fuck.
Relax. If the cracks of time were filled, and man had no place left to hide, what then?
I don't know. Oh, fuck. I don't know. I don't even know what the fuck you mean.
What happens when man must wait no more?
We become you.
Is that something you'd like?
I can't exist here. It's making me sick. You're killing me.
But there is only one certainty for man. Death. Yet man hides from this inevitability. Man desires more time to distance himself from it. However, the more time man has, the more it takes from him. Prolonging your existence comes at the cost of unknown suffering. Time determines all for man. Ironic that it should be both the gift and the thief.
What's it like in your world?
You cannot understand.
If you can bridge the gap between dimensions to communicate with me, then you can...
I'll pause it for a second to talk, but we'll get back to it. There's a lot there already. What are you seeing? I mean, he's in anguish. We talked about that before. We talked about as we learn and develop through the logos and open ourselves to higher dimensions, we have to address our fear. Because if we're afraid of it, if we get taught something like, oh no, God is unknowable, or God is a vengeful thing you must fear. Right. Yeah. So he has a negative reaction to it. So there's that part of our human development, our learning, addressing the false beliefs about the higher dimensions that might bring us fear, as well as developing the logos, which develops an understanding, a familiarity with what we're to experience. So we can recognize, so we can appreciate it, so we're not going to be afraid of it. That's the learning process. That's different from jumping in the deep end, right? We're climbing the ladder through the logos, through philosophy, through reading these texts that also participate in the logos, through reflecting on what was most meaningful, sharing what we saw, collecting key ideas. That's the journey. We're not getting booted straight out of the cave. We're climbing climbing the steep ascent to the real world. So there's a human part of it. It's pretty good. It also is talking about understanding and dimensions and time, in time, out of time. These are key logos terms that we're going to see in the Parmenides text. Time is one of the key ideas. He talked about what would happen if you were to see the way we see, everything all at once in an instant. Well, that's one of the hypotheses of Parmenides. That's literally one of the perspectives a human can have, or intelligence can have, alien or human. There's that element of it. The fact that it doesn't matter if you're an alien or a human or what time, if you have intelligence, you have a mind, if you become awakened to language, logos, you have this capacity. Likeness, sameness, these are two words that come up in the logos. In the self logos, we call the self logos because it's Parmenides' highest understanding of himself. And if the self is the ultimate cause, then the intelligent structure, the ladder must come from the self. So we call it the self logos. Sameness, I'll become the same as you if I can reach that dimension. That's one of the key terms. Is that something to be feared? Well, hang on a second. We studied sameness in the Parmenides. We recognize it's just one of the principles. It's not something to be feared. Again, the importance of having the logos with you in your back pocket as you evolve. That's philosophy. That's the nature of the education at the academy. That's what we're doing here. And that's what we're doing on this channel. So I hope you join in along with me. Also, the fear of losing. Right. Fear itself. So in philosophy, what are we doing as we climb the logos? Looking at the cause. What's the cause of musical patterns? Oh, these analogies. What's the cause of the galaxy's movement? Oh, these analogies. Well, what's the cause of that? Oh, the Fibonacci or the golden analogy. Well, what's that come from? What's the cause of that? Well, that's the pure being. What's the cause of that? We're going through a ladder of causes. So what's the cause of our fear? We can address it. So likewise, we can apply the same logos to our development as we can to addressing our blocks, our doubts, our fears. That's called philosophical midwifery, giving birth to the sick ideas that limit us. So he has a particular fear of losing his ego. This is a big one in philosophy. Well, if I evolve, then I'll no longer be that kind of person I'm used to being. I don't want to lose myself. In fact, let's go back to the text. Parmenides is asking Socrates, hey, have you asked, where is it? This is in the text. It's important to see it in the text as well. Part of the Logos journey is to make sure we see its expression and its confirmation in the text. And here we go. It's right after where we lived. Right, exactly, to lose yourself. That's why it's important that we're understanding the logos that we're on is the self-logos. We are not losing ourselves, we are remembering ourselves. A good way of thinking of it is this. When you were little, and you were a little kid, you had a certain view of yourself, right? But as you grow up, that changes. Your physical body changes, but also your idea of yourself changes. Your opinions change. Have you lost yourself? Or are you becoming more of yourself? Those images that you attach, those limiting, I'm just a this, or these labels or these groups that you identified with, limitations you had as a child. As you lose those, are you losing yourself? Or as you develop, as you drop them, are you becoming more yourself? We're following the self-logos. So back in the text, it finished with Socrates saying, "We're awakening ousia through the activity of the logos that will help us grasp these higher dimensional things, the things that are experienced all at once in an instant." Like the alien is saying, we see it as an instant. This is in the text too, instant. In fact, we're on page 9. The very first word of this text, and of course the structure of a text is important because that's part of the logos, is the pattern. The very first word, immediately we arrived at Athens. Immediately. All at once. Instantaneously. Let's zoom in for effect. Ooh, immediately. There's something significant. Take that with you in your back pocket as we go. We're collecting ideas, we're collecting questions as we go. Immediately. Has that got something to do with the instant that this alien is talking about? Now, we finished where we were by saying we want to grasp the one and the many through the activity of the logos that can awaken ousia. Okay, let's read this for a little bit and then go back to the video. So this is this story is being accounted by Antiphon, who heard it from Pythagoras, who was there. So Pythagoras was there for this conversation, and we're hearing it through Antiphon. Pythagoras then said, on the one hand, when Socrates has said these particulars, given what he wants to hear, he believed that both Parmenides and Zeno would be annoyed at each one of them. Whereas on the other hand, they offered up their mind, capital M, because that's the Greek word nous. Not just their intellect, their mind. The nous is the part of the mind that can grasp these higher dimensions too. So they're offering up a high part of themselves to what Socrates is saying. They offered up their mind entirely to what he said. The word under there is auto, which means self. So this is why we're reading this particular translation. It has the Greek in it too. So there are certain key words, like we talked about the Latin not having the word the, so they can't do metaphysics, they can't do philosophy. That's the problem we have. When we go to university, we learn many different opinions and we call them philosophies. We don't do the philosophy. That's the significance of words, key words. Now we have the Greek nous, that means mind. Altos means self. We lose that in the past translations. That's why this translation is the best. It's newest as well. They offered their mind to the self of what he said. And we know that mind and self are dimensions that are higher than our physical ones, so that's important. They frequently looked at each other, Parmenides and Zeno, smiling as if in admiration of Socrates. And that once Socrates ceased to speak, Parmenides then spoke, saying, Parmenides now, O Socrates, how worthy of admiration is your impulse in the pursuit of the logos. The first thing he said, he's judging him. He's a good quality person to talk to. And tell me, has your self separated certain ideas apart from themselves, as you say, on the one hand, and in turn, on the other hand, in the same way, set apart those that participate? So have you set apart likeness and unlikeness, one and many, and also distinguished them from the things that participate, like us, like hands, fingers, many fingers, one hand? Have you separated them apart? Do you know what you're talking about, son? And does it appear to you to be that there is a certain likeness that is separate from self-likeness? Now, for the Greek, the word self has an honorific function. Oops, I've lost my text. Oh well. In that the self can mean it. The self is a three-part analogy. Itself, the honorific, the highest excellence, and the self. It's a mean analogy. 1, 2, 3. So our question is, This is the infinity board, yeah. So when we're reading the text, whoops. He's saying, look, have you seen, has it appeared to you that there is a certain likeness in our physical world that is different, separate from self-likeness, the being of likeness, likeness itself, self-honorific. Self is the same as anagogic. It has an anagogic or honorific representation. That's what the word means. Which is why we need to add it into our English language, because the Greeks saw through their language. Just like Latin cannot see the, we have the, but we need a word like self that can exist on many different dimensions. The particular one, it. The honorific, the being one. And the highest one, the self, which is where we'll get to later. So does it appear to you that there's a certain likeness that is separate from self-likeness? And indeed, a certain one and a many, and all such particulars that we possess, and of which you have just heard from Zeno? Socrates like, yeah, it does. It does to me, indeed. Parmenides responds, and how about the following ones? That there is a certain idea, eidos, so it's a capital I in the English to distinguish it. It's not a concept, it's a being. There's a certain idea like that of justice, eternally, self by self, and also of beauty and of good, and all such ideas by themselves? Socrates says yes. What next then? Is there also an idea of humans and all elements, such as we are composed of? A certain ideal human self, and one of fire, and one of water, that is separate from us? Socrates says, I have certainly often been in dire straits, puzzled, at a loss, O Parmenides, concerning whether it is necessary to speak of those selves just as we did those ideas. Parmenides goes on, are you also puzzled about the following particulars, Socrates? Whether it is necessary to affirm there is a separate idea of each one of those that appear ridiculous, like hair and clay and dust? Do you think there's an eternal idea of hair? That's ridiculous. What about clay and dust? Or anything else that might appear without honor and appear worthless by being other in turn than those particulars which we're familiar about, like beauty and justice? Or whether it's not necessary for there to be an idea of hair and mud and dirt, or hair, clay, and dust, depending on your translation. I like hair, mud, and dirt, but it's the same. Dust and dirt, clay and mud. On the other hand, on the one hand, says Socrates, I do not affirm that these exist in any other way from these which we do also see. Whereas, on the other hand, is it not the height of absurdity insofar as one imagines that there is a certain idea of these selves, hair and mud and dirt? Nevertheless, at times, it also actually troubles me in regards to whether or not it's the same thing, whether it can be affirmed of everything. But thereafter, having been fixed in this opinion, I then run away fleeing in fear of falling at that time into a certain abyss of nonsense and utterly perish. He's afraid, falling into the abyss, by wondering if there's such an idea of hair and mud and dirt, like there is of beauty and justice and goodness. And perishing. This is the fear we've been seeing. We've been talking about the fear of losing the self. But then I reach up from these considerations and I seriously apply myself to these considerations, concerning which we have just now asserted, whether such ideas have to exist. So yeah, the fear of losing the self. Even Socrates had it. When applying his mind to contemplate the ideas or the beings on the higher dimension. Easy to think of the idea of beauty Do you think there's such an idea of hair and mud and dirt? So, I mean, we saw this guy afraid of losing himself, like we talked about, afraid of what it might be to see everything in an instant, afraid of sameness. I'd be the same as you, comprehending everything all at once. Yeah, these are interesting concepts. But all of these are levels of being that can be represented on the 9 hypotheses that represent all possible modes of seeing and being. That's Parmenides' self-logos. That's what Parmenides left us. We're only at the introduction where Socrates is asking his questions, and Parmenides responds, well, I can see you've got a worthy interest in the logos, but let me ask you this. What about this question? And he nails him. He gets it right to the heart of Socrates' issue. He asks him a question that really says, you know what? That's me as a human being. That's what I've been stuck on. Sometimes I run away fleeing in fear of falling into an abyss of nonsense and utterly perish. Even Socrates has these human problems. And Parmenides, as someone as a 60-year-old further along the path of the logos, was able to use his understanding of the logos to benefit him, to help him, to say, hey, look, this is where you're at, right? This is where you're stuck, right? This is your limit. Limit and unlimited self ideas. By the way, the sorts of key ideas that are that we look at in the self logos that are fundamental are called selfer ideas, the ones that have a self by themselves, like self-likeness. So limit and unlimited are selfer terms, selfer, selfers. So he uses his understanding of the selfer terms and his understanding of the logos to recognize what hypothesis Socrates is at, and he uses that in dialogue, in language, to help him. So, is this your problem? He draws it out of him and goes, yeah, I get stuck there. But this is me talking about the video. What do you see in this video already? With the human and the alien. We talked about the holographic nature of the universe before, and how in a hologram, you can see the whole in a part, like a fractal. You can blow it up. So if the logos is holographic in that way, then perhaps, maybe, the whole process of the logos can exist in its part, in an instant. Which means, while there might be a kind of pain or suffering that we go through when we're ignorant of the nature of self, that we're going through our evolution to reach the end of, to overcome that ignorance, overcome that suffering, if it is indeed holographic, then there might be a possibility for us to escape the suffering in an instant, all at once. Maybe just the suffering is the time taken between where the man is at and where the alien is at. But if it's a holographic logos in a holographic universe, maybe we can make that jump at any moment. Maybe it's always open to us, dependent on how open we are. Just like Zeno and Parmenides, they opened their mind to the self of what Socrates was saying. Maybe if we have a level of freedom to open our mind to the self of the logos, we can have it in an instant. That's a question. That's a possibility. I don't know. If that's true and you find that for yourself, please tell me about it.
In your world,
Sorry about that.
You cannot understand.
if you can bridge the gap between dimensions to communicate with me, then you can.
Bridge the gap to communicate. That's one of the hypotheses.
Then you can fucking try. You know things about us. and about our universe. Tell me.
If you're seeking answers to alter your understanding of reality, does that not make your world a projection rather than a perception?
This is the philosophical quest to remove interpretation from seeing. We don't want to project what isn't there onto what's there, and we don't want to leave out what is there. That's interpretation. So when we read Parmenides or we read a Platonic text, part of the work is separating our projection or our from the reading, which is why it's a yoga. It's a practice, as Socrates said. The activity of the logos is a philosophical yoga that awakens our highest consciousness because we're removing this projection.
What is the actuality? Do you see the world as you imagine it? Or are you observing what is really there? If reality is just a projection, what happens when the source, when consciousness is absent? Even with an eternity of self-reflection, man cannot understand the difference between actuality.
Well, he hasn't read the Parmenides, so we won't hold him too harshly to this statement.
And illusion. With every man born comes a new reality, all competing in perpetuity. Perhaps this is why man is so perpetually at odds.
We talked about this, didn't we? The difference between Greek and Latin, or the perennial philosophy, and the Stoic or modern philosophy. If it's all relative to opinions, then they're perpetually at odds. Philosophy isn't one, it's many. That's where we are currently, but we need to go back to the other one, where it's one. Interesting, one and many, the same self ideas that Socrates is talking about. So this alien has a similar problem than what we have. So maybe the alien can join us in a Parmenides read-along later.
So conflicted. So divided.
Stop! 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 Am I the only one you're doing this to?
Would you feel better if you weren't? You don't want to be alone.
I don't want to suffer.
You're in pain.
Yes, I'm in pain, and now I just have to sit here until I fucking die.
What if you could return to a moment in what you understand as the past, before you were sick?
If I were to travel back in time?
Yes. With the information you now possess. How do you think it would alter your behavior? What would you decide to do differently, if anything at all?
I would tell Ares to go fuck themselves.
You would choose differently?
I would stop this. I would stop you.
Remove us from the equation.
I can't.
You would be unable to see us.
Doesn't matter. I would know that you're there. I would know that you were watching.
The idea alone would change your perception of reality and therefore change your behavior.
Yes.
Ideas being able to change our perception of reality. Now we can recognize him at that first level that Socrates was on. Stones and wood, physical things. Ideas as concepts. But there's another level that we see in the Parmenides, ideas as beings to behold, that once we can see that, fundamentally changes our view of reality and our way of being, because it's a kind of movement that's not within the space of the current dimension, which is the movement to the next dimension. A kind of movement that isn't three-dimensional. So yeah, Alien has a good principle. He just needs to have a chat with Socrates or Parmenides, and maybe they can help him apply it to the higher. An idea of being that fundamentally changes your being. That's why Parmenides is so cool. That's why Platonic philosophy is so rad.
Why would you behave differently if there was nothing you could do to alter the situation?
It just would.
We find this curious.
We don't choose. We don't decide what happens. I didn't choose to be here. I didn't choose to get sick. Things happen that we have no control of. We don't just look at the world and paint it however we want.
If you really believe that, then you believe you are not in control and you exist at the mercy of all else. You believe your thoughts are of no consequence. If you were to return to a time with the knowledge you now possess that you did not before, what would it matter? What would our existence matter? What would our observations matter? If time was reset and you were put back, what difference would it make?
Well, what did you make of that? It's very interesting. Speaking of painting, it's interesting as a work of art. You can see that the director, or the author, the creator, is drawing on his own logos, is drawing on his level of understanding of reality, his understanding of the self-logos terms, time, sameness, infinity, knowledge. These are the same self terms that we're discussing and trying to discover on our philosophical quest in this channel, and by looking at the Parmenides and by reflecting on other examples of the logos. The author is himself at a certain level. We could even unpack some of the different levels he goes to. He talks about instant knowledge, that's a certain level. But then he falls down to a different level where it's all just a matter of projecting your perception. That sounds like relativism. But you're gone for 2 minutes. Well, I was just wondering what you thought, and I was thinking how the author himself, the artist who made that video, is himself creating from a logos, just as the divine creates from the logos. Only his logos might not be the same as the divine, as God's. And we can recognize some things, right? We can recognize he has a certain idea of time, knowledge, sameness, identity, fear, fear isn't a self-logos term, but these are all self-er ideas. And I'll throw the past Parmenides readings up on YouTube sometime this week, so you can catch up. And then as we go through it, when we get to the end of it, I'll if you've come along on the stream or on YouTube, we'll watch this video again, and we'll see if our perspective has changed about that. How about that? If you have anything that you want to particularly look at, particularly any Platonic text or any questions, just let me know. Send some messages. Send me an email. Thanks for hanging out.